When you think of North Korea, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's probably those huge military parades or headlines about nuclear weapons. But what about the people? What's it actually like to live there, day to day, to grow up, fall in love, just try to build a life inside what's probably the most closed-off country in the world? Well, today we're going to dive into that through the stories of people who actually lived it. This quote, this was the slogan. We have nothing to envy in the world. I mean, you'd see it plastered on buildings, you'd hear it in schools, it was constantly on the radio. It was this promise, right? The promise of a perfect worker's paradise, a country so self-sufficient and so great that you'd have zero reason to ever feel jealous of the outside world. So the stories we're getting into today come from an incredible book by Barbara Demick called, fittingly, Nothing to Envy. It's this amazing piece of journalism where she spent years interviewing people who defected, weaving their personal accounts together to paint this unbelievably vivid picture of what ordinary life was really like behind the curtain. So really, this is a story about what happens when people grow up believing that slogan with all their heart, and then what they're forced to do to survive when that promise turns out to be a complete and utter lie. It's about that collision, right, between this absolute, unwavering faith and a truly devastating reality. All right, so to really get what happened, we have to start by understanding the world they grew up believing in. So let's meet a few of the people whose lives are really at the heart of this whole story. Okay, so first up, we have Miran. She's a kindergarten teacher, but her family has what's called tainted blood because her dad was originally from the South. Then there's Jun Sung. He's a university student in the capital, Pyongyang. He comes from a really loyal, well-off family, kind of the elite. And finally, Mrs. Song. She's a factory worker and just a total true believer. Her father was a war martyr, so her family has perfect communist credentials. Just listen to this quote from Miran. It took us 3 years to hold hands, another 6 to kiss. Wow. I mean, that one sentence tells you so much about what daily life was like. It shows you just how incredibly conservative and controlled the society was. Think about that. Even a simple romance was this super slow, incredibly cautious thing because you were always living under the watchful eye of the state. And a huge reason for all that caution was this system called songbun. Basically, it's a hereditary class system that decided, well, everything about your life. Your job, where you could live, your education, everything. And you were born into it. For Miran, because her dad was from the South, her whole family was stuck in the hostile class. This so-called tainted blood meant that it didn't matter how smart she was or how hard she worked, some doors were just always going to be shut. So for decades, this super rigid system just held. It was the way things were. But then, in the summer of 1994, the entire foundation of their world just cracked wide open. It's July 1994, and Kim Il-sung, the great marshal, the nation's founder, dies. And look, you have to understand, he wasn't just a leader. To the people, he was basically a god. He'd been in power forever, since the country was created. People truly, genuinely believed he might be immortal. So when the news of his death comes over the radio, the entire country is just thrown into absolute shock and chaos. And this incredible outpouring of grief, it wasn't just spontaneous. It very quickly became a patriotic duty. You had these neighborhood groups, the Inminban, literally monitoring how often people were going to the statues to mourn. They were scrutinizing your face to see if you looked sad enough. It got so intense that hospitals started filling up with people who were dehydrated from crying so much or even having convulsions. Your survival could literally depend on how well you could perform your grief. So what if you didn't feel it? What if in the middle of all that you felt nothing? That's exactly what happened to Jun Sung. He's there, at his university, surrounded by all these classmates who are just sobbing, totally hysterical, and he feels this terrifying indifference. It's in that moment he realizes he's completely, utterly alone. His inability to feel the right way, it's his first shocking clue that maybe, just maybe, he's an outsider in his own country. And that thought? That was a dangerous, dangerous thought to have. So the god is dead, and the system that he built, well, it starts to crumble almost immediately. And the result was a catastrophe on a scale that's just hard to even imagine. First, the public food distribution system, the thing that had been the lifeline for families like Mrs. Song's for decades, it just starts to dry up. The rations get smaller, and then one day, they stop coming altogether. Then the factories close. There's no electricity, no materials, so state jobs just vanish. People have no income. The government gave it this euphemism. They called it the arduous march. But let's be clear, it was a famine that would end up killing hundreds of thousands of people. People had to do whatever it took to survive. I mean, they were eating things you can't even imagine. They'd strip the inner bark off pine trees to grind it into a kind of flour. They'd pound acorns into this gelatinous paste. People were putting nets on their balconies to try and catch sparrows. They were picking weeds, wild grasses, anything to add to a soup to fill their stomachs. Menharan, the kindergarten teacher, she had to watch her students literally starve. Her class went from 50 kids down to just 15. And this is what Mrs. Song, the true believer, realized. She said, "It was the simple and kind-hearted people who did what they were told. They were the first to die." Think about that. The people who followed the rules, who trusted the government to save them, who refused to steal or cheat. They were the ones who didn't make it. The famine completely flipped the country's morality on its head. Okay, so the state's promises are shattered. The system is broken. So naturally, some people start to wonder, what's really going on outside our borders? There's this saying North Koreans had about themselves. They joke they were like frogs in a well. Imagine that. You're at the bottom of a deep well, and all you can see is that tiny little circle of sky way up at the top. That circle of sky, that was the government propaganda. Everything else was just darkness. But a few people, like Jin-sung, were about to find a way to peek over the edge. So how did he do it? Well, being a university student in Pyongyang gave him some advantages. He got access to more books, more ideas. He manages to get a private room with landlords who don't see very well, which is key. Then he buys a Sony TV and figures out how to disable the fixed tuner that locked it to state channels. And then, for the very first time, he sees South Korean television. He sees a whole other world. And you have to imagine the shock of seeing these two realities side by side. On his state-run channels, the news is all about strikes and disasters in the capitalist world, and how South Korea is just this miserable American puppet state. But then he flips the channel, and he's watching the 1988 Seoul Olympics. He's seeing economic miracles, bustling cities, healthy, well-fed people, and maybe most shocking of all, he's seeing South Korean news reports about the famine in his own country, a famine his government was pretending wasn't happening. The frog had finally seen the world outside the well.
Well, once you have that knowledge, there's no going back. It changes everything. For Miran, for Jun-sung, and even for Mrs. Song, the true believer, the only choice left was to try and escape. But what they found on the other side, well, it wasn't some simple promised land.
Just look at how different the two Koreas had become after 60 years apart. The per capita income in the South was something like 20 times higher. You couldn't really surf the internet in the North, but South Korea had the best broadband in the world. And maybe the most shocking stat of all, the average man in South Korea was 5 inches taller than in the North, purely because of nutrition. It's like they were one people, divided by history into two almost different species. So for the people who made it out, arriving in this modern, fast-paced, wealthy South Korea was just a massive culture shock. Freedom wasn't some simple happy ending. It was really the beginning of a whole new struggle. A struggle with guilt, with memory, with their own identity. They were haunted by the family they'd left behind, and by the things they'd had to do just to survive. And that really leaves us with this final, powerful question. You can escape a system, you can even escape a country. But after all that, how do you escape the memories? For the people who lived through this, who saw that great promise crumble into dust, the deepest struggle of all is escaping the memory of what they lost and who they had to become to survive.